Hello everyone, today we talk about the Indo-European tribes and the rejection of the civilization of the mother. This video is the first one I'm making about an Indo-European history series that will likely take us far because it's slightly different both from what we have done so far. I mean, of course, the content, the knowledge, the comprehensive understanding of Indo-Europeistics will be, if anything, deepened. So with this content grafted on what we have already done, but also something different from what sort of Indo-Europeistics is mostly dealt with on the internet. That is mostly through strictly archaeological and or genetic insight. It's not like we will not cover this, it's baked into it, but in a more spiritual and, in this sense, imperial sense, I would argue. I don't want to even specifically say military or anthropological, but it's important to connect also with some content they haven't started yet that deals with a more metaphysical approach to history, in general, especially early history, and what, in fact, is conventionally described just on the basis of what conventional archaeology and historiography basically state, and is fine. I have the advantage of having come from, I'm a historian, so I'm not a specialist in those fields, but let's say I have been sort of educated with that full package. Nobody ever told me about, tradition with capital T up to a certain point. I would be aware of certain things. History of religion a bit opened my eyes in a broader philosophical interpretation of history. And especially ever since I've gone into traditional literature, and so mostly the mythology of these peoples and others, I've realized that there is a space that we'll have to properly narrate as far as the before, right? Because imagine that, again, we start all from this typically 20th century materialistic, deterministic thing. It's just what we find in the ground, etc. And having instead these very peoples telling us, of course, exposed through, the perpetuation of this tradition, but indeed something that we can pretty solidly trace back pretty much in time to prehistory, prehistorical, in fact, suggestions, memories, and more, as having a completely different dimension that is not simply, okay, there is a foundational myth and then all the rest follows, right? There is literally yet, the biggest part of, say, history unconventionally meant having happened before, and our sort of last millennia being just something, actually, we can say uneventful, also in a strictly metaphysical and Catholic sense, as far as the Indo-European tradition is concerned. However, of course, distant from the primigenial offshoot of the divine race. This video, as I was saying before, will not fundamentally just be about that. We will just try to couple a spiritual interpretation of Indo-Europeistics, of course, on the basis of archaeology and anthropology and more. I could say more, as you know, as always, but I don't want to make introductions too long. I will try to stay informative, and then you can rely on my Indo-European history playlist for further explanations. But this is a passage that we never properly covered. That is to say, the Indo-European migrations themselves. We discussed them here and there, but never in this sort of subject matter, topical themed content. Recently made, for example, a video about the early Italic participation to the Sea Peoples raids. We're talking, second millennium BC. This goes even more distant back in time, looking at the spiritual decision that brought the Indo-European world to take over. Another one that was largely dominated by essentially a feministic, communistic principle that can be, of course, debunked depending on how you want to describe certain cultures we describe now. That, however, definitely leaned towards that more telluric, collectivistic kind of approach, and that strongly contrasted with the Indo-European warriorism and pastoralism and other, in a way of life that, as you know, was eventually successful in overrunning the mostly the sedentary ones of Europe and the Mediterranean, to the point of making them Indo-European, right? In part genetically, in part linguistically, so that we identify ourselves as such today, largely. This shift is of overwhelming importance in the history of mankind for all a series of reasons I will not cover. There's also, however, a little bit of a warning, a disclaimer, when discussing these topics. Again, I'm not an expert in prehistory, in early history either, right? I'm a humble medievalist, as I often tell you. However, I spent my life studying mostly warfare and religion in fairly, detailed fashion. And even without that specific focus, like my academic career brought me to realize in a pretty macroscopical fashion, when you're habituated to work in a certain way, methodologically and thematically, that whenever we talk prehistory, regardless of the aforementioned sort of faith in this basically deterministic, materialistic, here I found the missing piece, so we sorted out everything. And I'll say it in the most sincere way, I think that nobody really concretely understands what the hell happened in the first place. Whenever we talk about, for example, the Indo-European ethnogenesis, migrations, etc., this is not to de-evaluate the notion of, say, of the area and the whole sort of ideology that at some point was really idealistically, in fact, propagated. We're talking especially the first half of the 20th century, also during Nazi fascism, with a specific ethno-racialistic ethos and more, that was eventually rejected, if anything, for equally ideological reasons, while history was actually in between. And it's not like what was done before or afterwards was just in the sense to look at and say, okay, well, we can't because it's flawed. Like, we work with a very big set of notions. Just think about the most famous and originally more clamorous issue regarding what was the sort of Indo-European Urheimat, right? And initially it was believed, at least by many scholars, that essentially the Indo-Europeans were born in a broader, let's say, in fact, spiritual and ethnically pinpointable sort of fashion, so to illustrate the development of European culture and identity from essentially what you could identify by the dwellings of the so-called corded Ware culture that we will profusely discuss today. So we're looking essentially at northeastern Europe, the Baltic as a whole, right? Whereas today we follow mostly Gimbutas's theory, which is the so-called Kurganic one that identifies the Indo-European so-called Urheimat in the Pontic steppe, in the Ukrainian steppes, up to actually far east into like up north of the Caspian Sea, with different groups that separated and also in fact bring to the separation of, say, the Europeans and sort of the Iranians, the Eastern branch, and so on. Made videos about the Tokharians as well. We covered this stuff very often. But this was, for example, it's a good example because regardless of the fact that Gimbutas's work is really, appreciable and is currently the most followed, the shift in this historiographical paradigm was pretty recent, right? In sort of speaking in terms of historiographical eras, right? And whenever we talk about all the various cultures that dwelled sort of before the arrival of the Indo-Europeans or just even their own ancestors in turn, etc., as you know, there is an enormously contentious debate. We're not going to answer these questions, nor in this video, probably nor in many others, but this is what I said before. Do not be overwhelmingly certain that something that is given, even in the moment, as sort of the most likely explanation, even when it actually is. It may not have layers to that, or may not have some sort of secondary aspects that are worth still being considered. Also, again, realize that, and we will see this quite prepotently, I don't know whether this autumn we will really take off in that direction, but with what tradition actually says about especially a specifically Western origin of the divine race, and there things get a bit complicated in terms of literal prehistorical references on the basis of archaeology, for example. And again, I don't want to spoiler anything, but if any of you is sort of acquainted with, which is likely in some cases, with where I'm going to, it's not Atlantis sort of conventionally or unconventionally meant, but it's something that emerges from the literal mythologies of basically of the world, right, in itself, and definitely is not just a random thing, nor I claim that there is necessarily any, let's say, I'm not claiming that I believe this or not, right, but I would really like to discuss this, because I noticed that, as you know, in pop culture, think about, I don't know, Hancock, like these charlatans, etc., like they're spreading some sort of conspiracies that in part are actually grounded, in fact, in some bases, but they have completely forgotten that there is an actually traditional layer to that, right? That gets down to aliens and to archaeology in that typical hysterical alienation from reality that is pertaining to a very specific part of the West, and that kind of metropolitan legends and hearsay that catches are helpful to catch the money of the mentally feeble. When you actually look at European tradition, and when you actually study history of religions and more, you actually discover, in a serious way, which is what we will hopefully try to do here, as we have already done it with some hundreds of videos dedicated to that, you realize that there is much more to it that nobody covers, and that therefore I think I can frankly do in the typical Schwerpunkt way. Today we will tackle also other issues, such as, for example, you've heard already the term Heimat, we could say Urvolk as a matter of fact. But as I said, by proposition for this series, we're looking at a spiritual history of the Indo-Europeans. And there is this major event that we suspend in time, in space, at least compared to especially what could have been before, and again, regardless of some unclear boundary, in the 4th millennium BC. I think I've never made a video about such an old time, especially for Europe. You can argue that, talking about the history of Europe, because this channel is dedicated to that, and this series, in a sense, with Indo-European identity, is dedicated to that. A distinctly European character emerges, right? Begins to take shape amidst the haze of really ancient prehistory. There is also a prehistory that, as you know, continues during the Middle Ages, right? Many peoples that we also get those mythologies from, etc., were literally not just the descendants of these. I think about, just recently we made a video about, again, the Eastern Frankish Kingdom, the evangelization of Central, Northern, Eastern Europe, the intertwinement before within the same Catholic tradition between the Norse, the Latin literature, and so on. But again, we're talking here about a relatively vague era in terms of historical traceability. We rely on a substantial amount of material that is, however, substantially scattered across sometimes even different centuries, separating the find or another. And archaeology, remember, that does not solve history. Archaeology does not have tags, right? We have the problem even for historical times say, was during the migration era in Central Europe. Without documentary sources, without historiography, you cannot reconstruct that simply as that. This development in the 4th millennium BC is marked by a spiritually profound decision. I will not stress, even though I must do it, the moral implication of this, and from a especially cosmological and theological and anthropological point of view, right? What is that Europe means and how was it created? Not by an accident, by, say, climate change, by any deterministic factor that magically prompts men as bots to do stuff so that we can appease who is scared of conceiving that an actual deliberation was taken at a point, also scattered, also, of course, throughout the centuries or the millennia by different groups, by different people, over so many generations, but still in a fundamentally identitary way, and that revolves around the rejection of the so-called civilization of the mother, right? Which would establish, in turn, like what could be defined as an Indo-European, but even better, European Urvolk, right? You know, this terminology is used actually for today anti-nationalistic purposes, not just because the term was used, again, in those times where, you know, the fascists had the upper hand, but because it's by the way, a Norwegian word meaning essentially primitive, primal, that can be differently translated peoples, and today is used mostly by nativistic whiners about, I don't know, that this people was here first or whatever, this kind of stuff. But that actually I would like to recuperate a bit in probably the affirmation of an Indo-European identity of Europe because of the actual Indo-Europeization of the continent that occurred at this point. Naturally, we looked at other times of migration/invasion in history. At some point, I would really like to make a video about these events through, for example, some archaeological survey in Serbia, where some of the greatest, as you know, centers and the greatest civilization actually of the modern Europe really existed, as we will see partly also now. And that allowed the Indo-Europeans to really spread further from Europe in a way that, we still identified, regardless of course, the overall European mixed genetic background in a prehistorically genetically stratified, in fact also pre-Indo-European ethnic background, a solid unitary European identity without any doubt. And again, migration-wise, we saw how there can't be a veritably cultural hegemony that eventually spreads because not, somebody arrived and everybody died, and so they left space for the newcomers that could replenish the entire system just like that. But because there was a consensual choice towards the change of a regime, that naturally must be understood because it is not banally, I understood that pattern, so it can happen to it. And you don't understand. That's not the point. That's how it was at the time for you to realize how today nobody has the palest idea of how to even think it in today's world. And literally nobody. Right? No culture. So and if it is, it's still within the West, within the truly European identity, which is not, in fact, some sort of fringe reality at the outskirts of it or whatever, because the core was corrupted. Again, the same Indo-Europeans proved this in ways that are basically impossible to repeat, not just to repeat, of course, historically, but to properly reenact in ways that can be considered comparable. This change in at this time, like in the 4th millennium, starting from the 4th millennium BC, because it protracted itself for other millennia. And so it's actually a pretty long process, entailed. And this is contentious because some scholars, of course, went after the idea, because it was proposed mostly by, again, fascist and Nazist scholars, that this, and also, people actually that had studied these things pretty well before them, in certain cases also after them, but at that point it could be accused of still being nostalgic or something, entailed a fundamentally, the choice probably for a fundamentally masculine and patriarchal society, right? The principle of virility that we discussed in many videos regarding the Sol Invictus, the concept of sacred royalty, stemming probably from the older warlike Indo-European conquest that constantly rebooted to some extent, and regardless also of specific migrations, as it's, for example, self-evident in the case of Rome, that is the most clamorous and sort of local in that mechanism. The reason why this would be contentious, by the way, is not really the fact that as it's self-evidently known, Indo-European culture was radically patriarchal, rigid, stern. Like we really studied this in many videos about different Indo-European peoples, even just language, right? What, for example, the Romans intended by the name of their phenotypes of their public offices, and we basically stumbled on different etymologies correlated to this also throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. So you can definitely grasp it from, as I was just saying, like every aspect of European identity. Rather, what is more contentious is the degree by which, as I was saying before, this great civilization of the matter would be sort of dominant, hegemonic, and how much of this truly had communistic and feministic characteristics. In part, it's just self-evident, but again, this video is not even specifically dedicated to solve this issue. It's rather illustrating the fact that we do know that a particular prominence through symbolism and general lifestyle compared especially to the Indo-Europeans definitely pointed toward that direction, and it's a motive especially that, and that's why I insist very much on that connection with religious history, that is beautifully illustrated by Indo-European mythologies. If you are aware, say, of the role, let's say, of the feminine deities in the Hellenic tradition, and other figures in general, also connected to actual historical, prehistorical peoples and their memories, etc. Like it's very notorious and much more meaningful than anything that archaeologists can tell us without, in fact, even having studied those things to begin with, which is too sadly often. So everybody knows how the Neolithic period was characterized by the dawn of agriculture and the formation of early settlements, when families evolved into something more, into clans and then into tribes, and there is even a sort of proto-national center to this, especially if we want to analyze, even in that beautiful Indo-European etymology, the meaning of the word natio in Latin, which is something that we're not going to do. We're saying this because some of the peoples that eventually we say we can still trace in later times, paradoxically, when they had largely become Indo-European in language and in customs, exist even before the arrival of the Indo-Europeans. So it's important to stress the continuity, as we made the case in many videos. It's not like Europe is unitary in its Indo-European identity because it does not contain across the continent what really enriches this backbone that decided to be unitarily Indo-European. And this is the true strength of Europe that people do not really understand because they reason in post-traditionalist terms of either a single unified thing or just fragmented nationalistic communities. They probably miss, like, of course, we live in 2025, so people have anything, but they haven't the palest idea of what we're discussing here is basically about, in that spiritual sense especially. And so this phenomenon occurs indeed in a moment in which Europe was already strongly populated for the times and the places, and that had largely been influenced, as it would also continue in later times, by Eastern and Mediterranean cultures. These influences manifest, for example, in the Thessalian settlements of Sesklo-Dimini, which inherit traditions from Middle Eastern communities. They weren't literally like, I don't know, people simply invaded Europe back in the day from the Middle East, and that's just it, right? Human mobility is not just probably one of the single most underrated aspects, in fact, in the history of mankind, but as I was saying before, we don't know everything. It also, in my opinion, has just a certain a limited heuristic value to want to stress too much, like what we know. Again, it's mostly archaeological finds, but what was walking on Earth is very difficult at some point to track before, again, codified conventional documentary history. We surely know, however, that, of course, the civilization of the matter had thrived on the basis of such influences. By following the Danube River upstream, because you arrive from Asia, you meet the Balkans, and then you rise up, this major waterway, these groups bringing agriculture essentially spread across Central and Balkan Europe. The Danubian culture, specifically the linear pottery culture, the so-called, in fact, LBK, we're talking mid-6th, mid-5th millennium BC, emerged as Neolithic groups from Thessalian settlements like the aforementioned Sesklo-Dimini, following the Danube River upstream, and it originated in Hungary and Serbia, in the sort of epicenter of its traceability, but it reached also Germany, Poland, cultivating cereals and legumes with simple wooden hoes. So this is what we call, by approximation, the Danubian culture. Of course, agriculture was spreading also in the rest of the continent. To the west, it was slightly more sheltered, but actually doing also, to some extent, more interesting things on other sectors. This culture is known for its ribbon-decorated pottery, hence its name from German archaeologists Bandkeramik, simple wooden hoes, and large collective dwellings, building large rectangular long houses, often 20-40 meters long, housing extended families in collective dwellings. So again, archaeological sites like, for example, Langweiler in Germany and Bilany in Czech Republic confirm these traits, reflecting a cooperative agrarian society. This would, even just in terms of settlement, reflect not just, of course, an agricultural world that had enough surplus to start also redistribute some of the same. Most of this economy was subsistence, the subsistence level. However, we can see in this promiscuity, right, in these great spaces, mostly, revolving around a center and with sort of equal sections, etc., an idea of more collective and communal lifestyle. This culture, and that's where we add the other piece from an ideological point of view, communicates its spiritual essence through small figurines depicting a nude female deity, the Mother Earth. What would properly be Ge-Meter, that, as you understand well from Hellenic references, not just there is the meter that is actually just like in the day that gets the corruption of the same term, that of course is Ge as Gea, as properly the earth, right? and matter as, of course, mater, mother, Mutter, and so on, right? So the Mother Earth, right? The great mother of the crops, who governs fertility and holds sway over life and death. The centrality of this figure is important, because naturally we find different representations, like different objects, different figures, but the naked goddess is really an importantly widespread symbology that arguably reigns properly from Mesopotamia to Asia Minor, Crete, Malta, and beyond. In Asia Minor at Cataluyuk, so we're in Turkey, we're talking between 6,000 BC, numerous clay figurines of nude females, often seated, famously enough with exaggerated hips and breasts, to signify the apotheosis of femininity, fertility, and so the immensity, the generosity of the Mother Earth that would in fact suckle her children, in the sense keep them sheltered and protected, etc., but also potentially swallowing them as the actual archetypal dichotomy in the history of religion, especially as far as the telluric, chthonic, in fact, feminine entity was sort of subjected to the patriarchal one. In fact, in the Indo-European identity, really tell. But in any case, were found as statuettes, were numerous ones, as in this, especially in Cataluyuk. Now we will see other. There's a very famous archaeological site that in fact hosts the seated woman, known of Cataluyuk, flanked by felines, which, as we've seen in some videos, were to be connected with the Dionysian aspect in the later Hellenic world, right? The panther was connected especially with it, symbolizing fertility and possibly protection over crops and life. But as we immediately understand also with this potentially dangerous and devouring aspect, that the felines, we'll see later, venomous knives, etc. So again, somebody you should be fundamentally afraid of. Chthonic, telluric cults are always about this. They're deterministic. This is what essentially the fourth estate or superstition is all about, looking at the dirt, not at the sky, and being thus dependent on, it's like the mentality of the socialist, of the communist. You're dependent on pre-arranged factors that do not depend on you, and you are subjected to this, and you're effectively psychologically inverted. You feel depressed and inferior. And you should just be thankful to something that is outside of you, if anything, and that you can't quite basically control, like the Gemeter. Achilar, I will be butchering some Turkish name here, 6,000 to 5,600 BC yielded similar ceramic figurines of nude females, sometimes in birthing poses, interestingly enough, tied obviously to the mother goddess cult. In Crete, the Minoan snake goddess figurines from Knossos were consistently later, in times, of course, in which there were already pretty strong Indo-European commixtions at a point. But as you know, in this specifically Minoan culture still being prevailing, in fact, the counter-Indo-European model in very prepotent terms. We'll talk about this probably in other in the videos about even the same italics in the Sea peoples. We are in 1600 BC. And here, though not fully nude, because things had naturally been changing over the millennia, but still you have this sort of very provocatively feminine feature of the bare-breasted woman holding snakes. So symbolizing fertility, regeneration, but also underworld connections. And again, the eternal symbol of the snake, the one slain by the Indo-European equestrian. Here I made multiple videos about that specific iconography, as well as the one of St. George and how it appeared in, again, specifically Indo-European realities. So there is always this threat actually connected. You don't have to trigger the Mother Earth, right? And these are the kind of, think about climate change extremists, the notion that, again, the Mother Earth, we offended her. Or you have these people, I once was raised Christian, but now, I rejected it, but I found really a new religion. I believe in the Mother Earth. And then that people believe, that communism is born just, with Marxism. I literally know people that think, that right-wing ideologies are born in the 19th century with nationalism. These things always existed, all right? And they are inherent, they are written in our genes. Like, we have this double switch. It's either one side or the other. It's either the transcendence or the involution. And this symbology, of course, had to do with this. It's like the evil eye, right? Watch out, because otherwise it will poison you. I will not give you enough food. You will die, because the power of the earth is not to be known by you. I'm just the only guardian of that, and I do not let you partake in it. Now, this faience figures, still thinking about Gnosis, found in palace context, by the way, so in societies that were definitely more advanced but could still uphold this feministic model, reflect indeed the Great Mother's role in life and death. In Malta, the Gantija temple, 3600-3200 BC, produced small limestone figurines of nude females with corpulent hips and bellies, known as fat ladies, representing fertility and the Earth Mother. The sleeping lady from the Hal Saflieni Hypogeum, 3000 BC, still in Malta, if I don't repeat it, again, it's because it's the same place, a clay figurine of a reclining nude female with red ochre traces is sold to depict a priestess or goddess tied to death and rebirth rituals. These aspects are very, very important because, as you understand, these women held actual power. And again, it's not like men were not present in the equation, they were not worthy, etc., but the broader moral temper of this system was female-ly ruled, right? And this naturally, together with the collapse of these systems, by the way, and the overrunning by the Indo-Europeans, is something you may want to, of course, memorize. Beyond these regions in the Cycladic Islands, during essentially the third millennium BC, marble figurines from sites like Amorgos depict nude females with folded arms, emphasizing breasts and pubic areas, like fertility deities linked to life cycles. In Sardinia, the Bonu Iginu culture, we are between the 5th and the mid-4th millennium BC, produced a clay figurine from Cucurusarius, now in Cagliari's National Archaeological Museum, showing a nude female mother goddess with fertility symbolism. So, as you understand here, we're looking at the same concept all across the board. And it's not, again, like the symbols are repeated in other say that this can be overlapped to other cultural situations. Like this specific Bronze Age mother goddess is very specific to this time and place in the way it's depicted. There is a lot of commonality to it. To an extent, of course, it's a universal symbol. You could have found it conceptually everywhere, but in the way it's represented, it's definitely typical and exemplificative in identificative of this specific time in history and preceding the Indo-European invasions of this great, again, agricultural, Neolithic, fundamentally up to the Bronze Age, civilization. Across Western and Atlantic Europe, from Spain to the British Isles, the same goddess is represented, in this case, often depicted with a dagger, right? Appearing in megalithic carvings that, as you know, are a bit of very specific characteristics of the westernmost parts of the European continent. This is very interesting because the eastern part of Europe, the Mediterranean, doesn't quite have this in the same way, in the same distribution, it's scarcer. There are reasons for this, especially just sticking to to Europe, you can understand how the steps, the different settlement patterns would have been something different. But what is fascinating here, these are all things we will see, if anything, in other videos. But what is interesting here is that the mother goddess was more explicitly associated in this area that had been surely invested by, again, the Neolithic, by Neolithic agriculturalism, but that was, in a sense, more sheltered from it, had identified the mother goddess already with some kind of more explicitly dangerous characteristic. It may have been a reaction to it, even in the moment in which she was evidently worshipped in there and embraced by these sedentaries. For example, in southern Spain, at the Los Millares site in Almeria, where between 32 and 2500 BC, stelae in megalithic tombs depict nude female-like figures with exaggerated hips and breasts, some with incised dagger shapes nearby, suggesting a fertility death goddess as well, and not just a natural death goddess, you know. In Brittany, France, today's France, of course, like for our Brythonic followers, the Gavrinis tomb, we are roughly in the mid-4th millennium BC, has a stone carvings of anthropomorphic female figures with dagger-like motifs on adjacent slabs linked to a fertility protection deity. But again, the sinister, venomous, snake-like dagger is definitely connected with the same notion. Again, you get bitten once and you die just out of what can come out of the earth, right? If you are not obedient to that, and if you look up to the sky, right, through you. This is the general sense of course, that these peoples, like aside from, again, any metaphysical implications here, were living in their own dependency on agriculture. And in fact, this sort of sedentary, mostly, let's say, working focused basis. Through the Mediterranean peoples spanning here, again, across the millennia, peoples that also came to change very much in between, like the Libyans, the Ligurians, the Iberians, also the Pelasgians in general, if you want to create this more mimical type of the Mediterranean dweller as depending on this agricultural cult. So this Eurasian and Euro-African mother sky permeates the core of the European continent. Think about that, right? In our times, in historical times, in European times, Europe is constantly, and we've seen it in the video about, again, the sea peoples, we'll see it again, is constantly dominating its surroundings. With Hellas and Rome, we've seen it in the Middle Ages with the European navies. We've seen it in the modern, contemporary era, taking over the world. Europe constantly dominates. This was essentially the only time in our knowledge of European history, geographically meant that Europe was practically dominated by a culture, right? It's not like they said that it was an empire across the Mediterranean or something, but that, was basically developing on the patterns, on the input of a civilization came outside of that, right? The tides will turn macroscopically and notoriously with the Indo-Europeans, right? And again, I just made that video about the Italics, the Sea Peoples, etc. That gives an idea of this. But if you, of course, are familiar with just the ancient European civilization, especially about after the so-called Hellenic Middle Ages, which is a bit of another contentious terminology, but we'll talk about that because they did happen anyway. And the so-called Bronze Age collapse, etc. If anything, contentious definitions rather than on what we actually know, in fact, that actually happened. You understand what radical shift occurred, and this is something that, say, is presented to you as if there were just different cultures that every once in a while, like one became hegemonic, and so this was the random turn of the Europeans. But as a matter of fact, it's all because it goes on and says, with different Indo-European peoples, like it was first this and then that. But do you realize the level of compactness that European identity represents throughout history in that regard? That's something we already explained in other videos. For example, addressing the fact that Europe was not politically unified at some point, not even during the greatest empires in her history, but that a European culture still existed. And in this sense, we are the most cohesively powerful culture in the history of mankind, right? And you can see, by the way, what kind of this Mother Earth represented in a deeper sense, also in other regions. For example, we just listed these peoples like the Libyans in North Africa. Display, for example, the Neolithic Saharan rock art at Tassili, Niger, today's Algeria, where between 6,000 and 4,000 BC, engravings of female figures with exaggerated hips and breasts, sometimes nude, interpreted as fertility deities. These figures found in cave shelters reflect a mother goddess linked to life and nature that indeed influenced Mediterranean cultures as a whole. In Liguria, that would eventually be Indo-Europeized by the Italics, by the Celts, and likely, again, as we will see today, time allowing, Indo-European migrations had been happening for a very long time already. So we are in essentially between northwestern Italy and southern France. You have the final Neolithic and Copper Age rock carving at Montebello, dating to the third millennium BC. In the Ligurian Alps, depicting anthropomorphic female-like figures, some nude, alongside agricultural symbols like plows. These are thought to represent a fertility goddess, possibly a sky or earth mother, because, of course, the associations with celestial power was coming together with the Indo-Europeans, but still it was a much more prominently telluric fertility goddess tied to, at this stage of the Ligurian people's spiritual beliefs. In all this, there are, however, two major areas of Europe that remained unaffected by the mother's dominance, right? We are looking at essentially the Baltic and the Pontic steppes. These two areas are different, both climatologically, in terrain. They're also pretty wide, yet they are notoriously comminated by the Indo-European migration spread, especially from the Ukrainian steppe at large to the Baltic. Approximately, we're talking respectively the Yamnaya in the Pontic plains and the so-called corded Ware culture on the shores of Scandinavia and Central Eastern Europe. The interplay between the two from a strictly migratory way we will not cover today. We will see now, of course, that we know that corded Ware culture is deeply connected with the Yamnaya one, also at a genetic level. This was essentially... There are actually different theories. I've read something a bit more in depth, and I can tell you there is not like a uniform consensus about the distances, the movements, the chronology. We just, again, very generously concede to historiography the fact that they are the only ones who have properly researched this. At least they have researched them better than anybody else, so that the status questionis is to this. I will not comment on this. I will not criticize. I'm not coming from that standpoint. My standpoint rather wants you to focus on the differences between these two areas, regardless of the fact that, again, they were like communicating vases, and so there is no doubt in this moment that at least both areas were very Indo-European. but people also lived very differently in there, because essentially in the Baltic there were sedentaries, whereas in the Pontic steppe there were nomads, and that is quite important. And more than else, in the Indo-European history, and especially prehistory, so probably in the Proto-Indo-European times, in this long age of migrations, there are two main different directions of Indo-Europeization of the continent. That is to say, one from the steppes that seems to have informed mostly the Balkans and a certain part of the central Mediterranean, and one from Northern Europe that extended mostly towards the south, from there also to the outskirts in the west, and also descended into Italy, where likely, in fact, the two branches also met, which is quite fascinating. Naturally, branches, quite categorical terminology. We have to imagine these Indo-European warriors, especially after we will see now, 2000 BC, because I made also a bit about the beginning of chariot warfare. The Andronovo culture is also pretty far away in Kazakhstan. But at that point, like, again, human mobility is very pronounced, and especially the political compaction stemming from this militarized war bands punches in all directions and pierces through and expands far and wide. And so you have Indo-European errant charioteers crossing a pretty large space and intensifying ever since. And we probably underestimate for how long this had been going on already, right? That is to say, how much Indo-European Europe likely was. Also to have this resultingly deeply ingrained into European identity on the longer run, right? We can't just barely document some movements, but we will surely come back on them for the few that we know, at least in other videos. Today's point is focusing on the two worlds, right? Let's start from Northern Europe, right? So the area that would develop the so-called corded Ware culture. This region encircling the southern Baltic is defined by its beech, yew, birch, and fir trees, and is home to wolves, bears, salmon, and beavers. Linguistic geography identifies this area as the Indo-European Heimat, together with the Pontic steppes. It is also the homeland of the Nordic race, where from the mid-4th millennium BC, local groups of hunters and fishers, in part descendants, by the way, of the glacial era, so-called Magdalenian communities, transitioned into a new agricultural society, right, in the sedentary world, that, however, remained separate from the Danubian world and the Great Mother. By the way, a choice that could not simply be across the millennia simply as, because they were distant from there. First of all, it's not such a huge distance to begin with, but it's obvious that there was already a cultural divide between the two. And we know this very well because still the peoples inhabiting there in historical times, for how we documented them through Germanistic, starting from Caesar, Tacitus, etc., tell us pretty well that even though these were some of the most infantry-based peoples out there, they still had, like most all Indo-Europeans, that were consonant with them. That's why, for example, the Romans noticed were obsessed with equestrian cults. They had that sort of higher sense of the manner, but in many ways, of course, this derived from that, in part also from that environmental circumstance where surplus was particularly scarce, agricultural yields were pretty poor, and the whole system was naturally very fragile for the technology of the time, especially where it's colder, right? And so the idea of raiding, plundering, etc., in many ways was also the only way to make things work, but this does not account from the generally Indo-Europeanly militaristic mentality that you find, in fact, in the great empires of Macedon, of Rome, and it is expansionistic imperial existence that characterizes Indo-European power, and identity and beauty and more, right? It's something deeply ingrained and celebrated in all these people's mythologies as the single most fundamental notion of manifestation of life, right? It actually stems from a divine love and in this capacity to, in fact, to overwhelm the universe, hence the fundamentally, inextricably, and absolutely Catholic essence of the Indo-European identity, in the single most deeply intimate originality of the same culture, one that man could reach by becoming God himself, something that the mother goddess would not tolerate if not in a continuous re-chewing of her own children, right, in the decomposition and blossoming cycle, etc., that we will talk, if anything, better on another occasion. So this aspect, like the absence properly of the mother goddess in the what would be the corded ware culture that was in its antecedents, is quite fascinating, right? So Northern Europe was, during the Neolithic period, particularly when you look at Scandinavia, northern Germany, home to cultures like the Funnelbeaker culture. We are between 43-2800 BC. Archaeological evidence from sites like Skarabrae, the Orkney, 31 BC, and megalithic tombs in Denmark and Sweden shows no clear depictions of nude female figurines or carving akin to the Mediterranean mother goddess. Instead, these Funnelbeaker culture sites yield abstract symbols such as spirals or axes and occasional anthropomorphic figures, but these again lack the explicit nude female iconography tied to fertility seen in Thessaly or Malta. Right? This is extremely important because, as you understand, this symbolism was in fact tied to the godfather, right, of the sky, and it promotes again solar symbolism, heavenly force, warlike characters, axes. We will see this now better. For the Pontic steppe, so where the Yamnayas lived, this is important. There are actual influences from the Mediterranean, but they're more nuanced. And actually, the same Yamnaya culture did not intermingle with this. You can see in later times, the Scythians, when described by other peoples, they had also some chthonic elements, etc., but the prevalence was definitely heavenly, right? So when talking the Yamnaya, we're looking at 3300-2600 BC, dominating the Pontic Caspian steppe because they stretch far east in that. And as we'll see now, also they expanded famously from there across Asia, Eurasia, of course, also from the other side, and it's mostly associated with this Indo-European expansion from a naturally pastoralist background. Archaeological evidence from Kurgan burials, for example, in the Dnipro-Donetsk region, include stelae known as, in fact, the Yamnaya ones, some depicting anthropomorphic figures, but these are rarely nude or explicitly female, right? What people get confused with is the and more, in fact, Mediterraneanly tied Cucuteni-Tripilian culture. We're talking 4800, 3000 BC, partly overlapped in chronology with the and also by geographical proximity with the Western Pontic steppe in modern Romania and Ukraine. This produced numerous clay figurines of nude females with exaggerated hips and breasts. So we are the same mother goddess model. Those were found, in fact, at Cucuteni in Romania, roughly 4000 BC. These finds, like the Tripilian site of Sabatinivka in Ukraine, dated to the same period, yielded similar nude female statuettes, often in domestic context, by the way. So properly with a cultural temper that is not the rigid, virile, patriarchal, like probably the patriciate that the Indo-European culture would spread far and wide, right? This indicated instead fertility, worship tied to agriculture, and it is because those westernmost part at the end of the Pontic steppes were sort of more agricultural and connected to this mother symbolism. Otherwise, when you look at both the corded Ware and Yamnaya, you do not find, again, for millennia in their existence, practically any mother goddess contamination. We can imagine there would have been. The system was not monolithic or categorically separated, but also the distribution does not lie. These were substantially different peoples in spirit, in heart, and they truly believed something else that we will see now, right? There is also another interesting aspect about the corded Ware, that is the overlapping of the Nordic culture with the pre-Indo-European megalithic one that was admittedly reaching its end in a broader picture, but that basically witnesses this northern Indo-Europeans imposing stone tombs that reflect a robust political and clan-based organizations in their own regard. This was connected with the previous globular amphora culture that was not technically not an Indo-European one, but genetic studies suggest a consistent part, like approximately say 30% in the European genetics that is actually pretty strong overall, right? And thus also corresponds to other levels of essentially of genetic background of other European regions, right? This is important because, let's say, this is based on the similarities with the Yamnaya, and the corded Ware culture, of course, had very high levels of that. So this is happening in a phase in which basically these peoples are migrating from the Pontic steppe towards Northern Europe and are basically seizing control of these megalithic centers and cultures. And these form, in a sense, yet another foundational step of the Indo-European identity. Also, let's say we can imagine, for example, from a linguistic point of view, when is it that these tongues would have started to become probably prevalent in sedentary Europe. That's a very important step, initiating a dramatic transformation that will sweep through Europe and vast areas of Asia, because you understand that also from a demographic point of view, these areas were saturating, right? And that different waves of expansions, as you know, throughout all the rest of Indo-European history will occur towards the rest of the world. This is quite relevant because truly the Yamnaya started in Europe, right? Started in Ukraine. And from there, basically the Indo-European dominance of the steppes and beyond, taking over the Indian subcontinent, like the entirety of Europe, etc. Like is the think about all the Iranian branch, also in the Middle East and Caucasus, etc. is something insane, right? They arrived up to East Asia, right? And the Indo-European dominance of the steppe will practically not end until the migration era. This is, and when, of course, Indo-European cultures had otherwise very much established themselves elsewhere outside of the steppe. So this is a very important step, the birth of the corded Ware culture. Besides, we have very specific evidence of how Indo-Europeans stemming, now we will address the topic, like, because at this we will see now, big spoiler, the Europeans explode, ready to start migrating en masse for those time standards to lots of places. Probably this had already been going on for a while, just by especially geographical scope, but not with that intensity. And we understand that the Indo-Europeans seized control of these megalithic centers, and they began to build megaliths as well on their own, also on the fringes of Europe, because as we explained, the megalithic phenomenon in Europe is very much an Atlantic thing for some reason. We're looking literally at, Brittany, like all these corners or Europe, from which, by the way, they later expanded also in these pre-Indo-European cultures, and during this, especially the latter phase of megalithic culture, when the Indo-Europeans had already arrived. We will talk about who were those men, why they did so. As we've seen, they had already a sort of a different idea and perception and representation of the mother goddess. But just some example of how we can trace Indo-European influence on European megalithic sites as well. Corded ware single graves, Jutland Peninsula, Denmark, roughly 2700 BC. Stone-lined single graves with corded pottery and battle axes reflecting steppe-derived burial practices. Kujawi long barrows, Poland, roughly, here we're talking roughly, of course, in dating, 2800 BC, corded ware earthen and stone barrows, often with single burials, distinct from funnel, beaker, dolmens, showing Indo-European influence. Stone cists, Mittelelbe-Saale, Germany, roughly 2600 BC, corded ware stone cists with individual burials and solar motifs linked to steppe ancestry. Bell beaker cairns, Iberian Peninsula, stone cairns with single burials and beaker pottery in Los Millares, as we mentioned before. We're roughly third millennium BC, reflecting Indo-European migration. Passage grave, Carrowmore, Ireland, more or less the same period, a late megalithic tomb with bell beaker influences containing beaker pottery and steppe-derived artifacts indicating Indo-European integration. Dolmen of Menga, Antequera, Spain, roughly the same period of megalithic tomb with later bell beaker burials, because the bell beakers were essentially the image, and you see it also on the map, like you have the corded ware, that is essentially the Baltic, and the lands perspicient to it. You have the Yamnaya, which is the Pontic steppes, and up to the Caspian Sea. And then basically the Indo-Europeans that take over Western Europe are called bell beaker culture. And so they're also blend, of course, of the pre-existing populations. It would have been the case in other circumstances. Here, again, we don't even talk about the Indo-European ethnogenesis. That's just another issue. So you understand how apparently sudden this invasion is, right? We're talking the second millennium BC. These waves will keep happening. We know, unfortunately, too few about this. These are, again, still before chariots were around. The horse was domesticated already. There was a gradual spread of lots of things we can't fully track, right? But we can see, we can tag the Indo-Europeans because of this complete change in spirit, in symbolism, in ideology, right? Warlike symbols, heavenly symbols, Godfather symbols, right? In parallel, so we are looking at, when you look at the Yamnayas, the same thing were happening, because the bell beaker culture is likely stemming mostly from the corded ware one, and or at least from groups that were closer to it. When you look at the Yamnaya, their region spanned, again, the Pontic Caspian steppe. It was defined by its sweeping grassland dotted with oak and ash groves, rivers rich with sturgeon and carp, home to wild horses, aurochs and saiga antelope. Linguistic geography identifies this area again as the primary Indo-European Heimat. It's the homeland of the Yamnaya pastoralists, where from the 4th millennium BC, mobile herders, descendant of earlier steppe hunter-gatherer communities, forged a pastoralist society centered on kurgan burials and horse domestication, distinct from the Danubian agricultural world, and that had a greater mobility than other groups. Yes, the corded ware were possibly more cohesive, turning out to be fairly more also demographically concentrated, etc. We'll see now what implications this brings. but the Yamnayas were more mobile. So it's extremely difficult to try to even imagine a capacity of distinguishing the historical pathways of these peoples. First of all, because they happen over the course of millennia. Secondly, because even the geographical distances do not actually show something like an immediate, okay, like if a guy was closer, he could not go from the other to the opposite end of Europe and back, because they did that, right? And that's how blended Europe became with the Indo-Europeans of different derivations. In any case, connected with the Yamnaya. Again, it's important to stress here also the genetic connection, because the Yamnaya culture as a whole did not, say, empty itself by migrating to the Baltic, right? We know from Yamnaya ancestry finds, like in the corded Ware sites of Zvegnjek in Latvia, dating to the 1200 BC, where single grave burials and cord-decorated pottery are quite telling that the Yamnaya ancestry genetic evidence is up to like a 3/4, right? But it's rather the political time that is different, right? Surely there had been a migration, a cultural diffusion. These peoples had not basically abandoned their fundamental mentality, which, as you understand, is stronger than lifestyle, even though lifestyle would have been fairly similar in intentions, but again, not in means, because there is a passage from sedentarism from nomadism to sedentarism. The corded Ware culture is, in this sense, more distinguishable, are more sedentaries. And some Indo-Europeists basically thought that there could be a possibility to trace, for example, the Indo-European ancestry of different peoples in Europe to either of the two, depending on some factor. For example, I've seen this as far as the Italic peoples were concerned, that at least some historians proposed in a speculative way that the Latino-Faliscan branch would have descended from Northern Europe, whereas the Oscans from the steppes, right, passing across the Balkans and populating the Adriatic, for example. Speculations. We know too few about that. We just know that at some point the Indo-Europeans appear. It would be extremely interesting to see what kind of connection really existed, because the in-between is too vague, and it's frustrating, to say the least. In any case, what we know, certainly, again, is this tide, right, that from the beginning of the 4th millennium BC, but very much intensely, especially as we've seen here, by the mid-3rd millennium BC, began to launch incursions across Central Balkan Europe. What is fascinating, by the way, is that the corded Ware culture partly expanded into the southeast as well. It's as if, I don't know, think about the migration era, right? The Germans were descending from the north, and they even ousted the Iranians. Now, from Ukraine, they mixed with them. This is something similar that likely happened in those times. We know because originated from their strongholds across this area. That could be both, again, the Ukrainian steppe or the Germanic lowlands. The Indo-Europeans, wielding their battle axe, disrupted the tranquil communities of the mother, reshaping the archaeological landscape all across the continent. The Yamnaya were the primary drivers, spreading Indo-European languages, pastoralism, and Kurgan burials westwards. However, as we know, they were at least to transform once having seized control of certain areas. Genetic evidence shows their steppe ancestry, as we've seen in the corded Ware, so that's how it had happened to begin with there, which spread, as we've seen, in northern Central Europe, including the Baltic, by 2800 BC. Like in Western Europe, corded Ware groups like the Bell Beaker culture, so between 28 and 1800 BC, carried their steppe ancestry into regions like Iberia and France, so the westernmost areas of the continent, mixing with local populations, also historically with particular consequences in that regard. In general, the intensity of the Indo-Europeans is stronger in especially in the eastern and the central part, and in the northern, because if anything, they probably took over those resources that were too meager for the pre-Indo-Europeans to just survive out of that. They were probably also much more selective groups, right? So when you look at, for example, Britain, etc., like, well, we'll talk about that too. It took more time. That, as we will see in the end, would also leave traces of even the feminine deities into, for example, Gaelic epos and mythology still echoed in the Middle Ages, etc. Something very different from, for example, the purely Apollonian, Hellenic, Dorian mentality, like, or the Roman, like heavenly regeneration, right? So it's something actually more obscure and ambiguous. In any case, in the Mediterranean, the Yamnaya-related migrations reached the Balkans, where also in 2800 BC, they definitely swarmed into Greece at some point. We know that because by 2200 BC there was a substantial mark left in the country. Think about the early Mycenaean graves. But corded Ware impact there was paradoxically scarcer. We will understand also why at some point in the Hellenic culture. I made a video about the rise and fall of the Hellenic civilization in the European perspective. Actually, Hellas was populated enough also before the Indo-European invasions to probably absorb much more of these in a demographic sense, and much more could be said in the form in which Hellenic civilization came out to be. But this does not mean even that, as we've seen, actually the Hellenic culture could not have had the strongest Apollonian understanding of the Indo-European mythology, this spiritual shift, compared to all the rest of Europe, as a matter of fact. It's a bit like the Vedas in Asia, even though, again, there were also other peoples we probably forgot about because they didn't leave so much, tradition next to them. But again, it's something complicated that I'm trying to deal with in a single video, and I know it's dangerous to do. So, the notion, however, that the Yamnaya were the primary drivers in eventually the capacity of taking over Europe is more contentious, meaning, sure, the corded Ware were the direct descendants of the same, but they took this turn, right? Archaeological evidence shows corded Ware expansion into Central and Eastern Europe, including Poland, Germany, and parts of Ukraine. So in a sense, this corded Ware culture came to be expensive, even backwards, geographically speaking, from their original Yamnaya source. And this is, in my opinion, incredibly telling because, again, it seems incredibly similar to what happened in other historical times. And my opinion is that the corded Ware culture may have been much more impacting than in fact, the same Yamnayas across most of Europe, but including areas that were, in fact, closer to in fact, the Yamnayas, to the Pontic steppes themselves, right? And in fact, we find in the same Ukraine corded Ware sites overlapping with the late Cucuteni Tripilian culture, right? Indicating interaction and replacement as seen as sites like Usatove, as a matter of fact. What do I mean by this? Well, I mean that when we look at certain important groups in the history of Europe. While it's difficult to unsee lots of Yamnayas crossing into the Europe from their eminently equestrian culture, the decorded Ware would have not had also later on in the same way. It would actually be the latter that had more cohesively compact infantry forces. After all, when we look at the sea peoples, what were we looking at? Particularly good horsemen. Surely they would have had that, but we're talking mostly of strong infantries that were stronger than, for example, the Bronze Age Middle Eastern ones that caused pretty severe havoc all across the board. As we've seen also in the recent video about the Italics, etc., like who were these peoples, if not the inhabitants of essentially Central, Southern Europe, the Balkans, etc., but they didn't look as pastoralists. The Scythians looked like pastoralists, and we know that they were already around, and in that sense, they can be easily characterized. We also made some videos about them. So when we start talking about Indo-Europeans here, we're talking Europeans in quite straight. By the way, Indo-Europeans because eventually, like a chunk of the easternmost part of the, not even the Yamnayas, they're called the famously enough the Sintashta, right? And there is Andronovo. You see it in the map. But the Yamna are basically between the Carpathians and Kazakhstan, right? When we look at corded Ware, we realize this is a big chunk of, yes, northeastern Europe, but it eventually fell towards the south and brought various migrations that were more likely just to be so culturally impacting in Europe, not much even to the southwest, but to the, we're talking before the Celtic migrations, but to the south directly, for example, the Italian peninsula, again, also the Balkans, that there is, in fact, we pointed that out, there is not much of a direct Yamnaya influence, for example, in Greece. I'm not saying, again, that the Dorians came straight out of Scandinavia or things like that, but it's possible that probably, given the incredible mobility of these peoples and given the demographic concentration of sedentaries compared to the nomads, at large, we can think of corded Ware having done most of the job, right? Also, why did the Yamnaya migrate to northeastern Europe? They didn't have any better place to go? Obviously, because they were they were nomads, and generally speaking, nomads do not fare well against sedentaries on the longer run. It's not like Europe becomes nomadic, right? So they migrate to a place that was relatively more fringe and also less hospitable, like the northeast, and from there, also because they were in part desperate, considering, I don't know, at that point, yes, also climate shift, etc., they began to send out waves of war bands and probably some entire chunks of people to colonize other places. They are also much more easily towards the south rather than too far away in the west, even though they did reach that as well, but probably in smaller numbers to an extent. So this is, again, incredibly, because naturally later on you have, again, the Celts, you have the Germans. Again, there is also further Indo-Europeization of some, especially the westernmost fringes of Europe, right? But in the moment, also the greatest riches that would attract them, as the sea peoples show us, would be in the east. So everything sort of adds up, and it can't really quite be denied that also we've seen it very much in the Bronze Age warfare, mostly revolving around Mesopotamia, that especially in that region, the Indo-European influences are very strong, right? They are Semites, right? But they have so many of these warriors. This is also a bit later, of course, compared to what we're immediately discussing here, so that Indo-Europeans would have well established themselves in places like the Iranian plateau, in the Indian subcontinent. Again, you start having the Scythians roaming around in ever more organized way. Cavalry also starts developing later on after chariotry itself. So that's really a later time. It's already basically the Iron Age. However, the Indo-European migrations were also continuing a bit during those times in the West. We will see now how. Now, Notably, this broader Indo-European invasion coincides with the emergence of solar symbols. The swastika appears, solar symbol of benignity, of power, of health, with its earliest known instances in places connected also with the corded Ware culture. Of course, the swastika was a much earlier symbol, but it was not so widespread as we see instead in this overwhelming Indo-European expansion, because the same solar symbol, as we've seen, was connected with forces that were not worshipped at the time before this Indo-European tide struck. Right? This goes alongside with other symbols that are basically always revolving around the same concept: arrayed crosses, squared circles, dotted discs, and radiant discs. Just to make an example, the corded Ware culture witnesses the radiant disc in a ceramic vessel from the Mittelelbe German area, where in 2600 BC it bears the circular motif with radiating incisions identified as a solar symbol in pottery decoration. There is a corded Ware pot from Jutland in Denmark, 2700 BC, displaying a cross with radiating lines confirmed as a solar motif in burial context. Because, by the way, archaeologists sometimes say, but this is actually not a solar symbol, we can't know, whatever. There is a pattern here that cannot be discarded, and these are sort of the conventionally recognized solar symbols involved. A pottery fragment from Czerniki Gorny in Poland, 2800 BC, showing a circular design with radiating lines, recognized as a solar symbol in corded Ware funerary ceramics. Speaking of square cycle, a corded Ware vessel from Kitrz, Poland, 2700 BC, featuring concentric square and circular incisions interpreted as a solar-related geometric motif. By the way, again, even if Indo-European migrations had began earlier around, you realize how concentrated this stuff is around the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC, right? When the greatest waves set themselves in motion. We have earlier evidence, by the way, of these solar symbols in globular amphora culture sites that, as we've seen, were technically not Indo-European, but they might have started being hegemonized by them already. And this symbol is also to be found in more consistent fashion. A pottery fragment from Zabolotia 3, Ukraine, 2900 BC, has a circular design with radiating lines confirmed as a solar symbol in this group. The square circle, a vessel from Kujawi, Poland, showing concentric square and circular incisions, recognized as a solar motif in burial goods. Radiant disc, a ceramic piece from Volhynia, Ukraine, bears circular motif with radiating lines, identified as a solar symbol. Radiated cross, a pottery shred from Kierzkowo, Poland. These others were from respectively 3000 BC to some went as far as saying 2550 BC. This one is 2900 BC, displaying a cross with radiating lines confirmed as a solar motif. For the Yamnaya culture, it's also important to identify this stuff because, again, they spread this themselves. A radiant disc, a Kurgan stela from Mikhailivka, Ukraine, 3000 BC, featuring a carved circular motif with radiating lines, is recognized as a solar symbol in Yamnaya funerary art. Squared circle, or ceramic vessel from the lower Dnipro region, Ukraine, 3100 BC, has concentric square and circular incisions, identified as a solar motif in Yamnaya pottery. Radiant disc, a stone stela from the Donetsk River region, Ukraine, 2900 BC, showing a circular design with radiating lines confirmed as a solar symbol in Yamnaya Kurgan context. Rayed cross, a pottery fragment from the Uzatovo group, Yamnaya related, Ukraine, roughly 2800 BC, bears a cross with radiating lines, recognized as a solar motif in steppe ceramics. This tells you how actually present this new celestial Apollonian Uranian tension in the European culture was. And this does not stop to Europe, as you know, because the Indo-Europeans from these regions will start migrating far and wide, taking over most of Eurasia. Such rich symbolic repertoire, for example, reaches its peak, arguably, in, where? Troy, right? A city bridging Europe and Asia, famous enough because of the Homeric epos, that, in this sense, does have, especially in the Iliad, as you know, an incredibly strong Indo-European ethos, even though, of course, like general epos, if you look at more Levantine tradition, it was similar, but Troy is not a random city, right? If you just wonder about that. And it heavily signaled, actually, this movement of the Indo-European groups into Asia Minor. The swastika as well, an ancient emblem, as we were remembering before, generation, the rebirth of light, is tied to the initial emergence of Indo-European peoples in the 3rd millennium BC in this areas, right? Only reaching India and China 1,500 years later, which is impressive anyhow. And we may even think that probably the Chinese Empire was once founded by some kind of Indo-European errant warrior, where we have plenty of such symbolism. Among probably the confirmed one, for not talking about the rest, that, however, does look like certain geometric concepts were already there. Think, for example, about later Hellenic so-called geometric pottery. Like it stems from that heavily Indo-European Dorian style that was conceptually mirroring here all the celestial vault and bodies and movements, and they had all a specific meaning. In Troy, specifically Troy 2, because as you know, the city was destroyed here just by the story, but multiple times. So we're roughly, the chronology is 2600, 2250 BC. This was such an important center already at the time. In archaeological evidence shows solar symbols in material culture reflecting Indo-European influence, likely via Yamnaya, but possibly, as we just pointed out, corded Ware-related migrations as well. This is, again, very important because they were already fairly well distinguished from one another in properly lifestyle, in settlement types. They would join together in similar ways, but they were different. But we don't really know who was who. A ceramic vessel from Troy 2, excavated by Schliemann. So this is a found from, again, the aforementioned, especially I think the beginning of the periods of 2600 BC bears a radiant disk with incised radiating lines identified as a solar symbol in pottery decoration. Another Troy 2 find, a clay seal from the Megaron, features a square circle with concentric incisions recognized as a solar motif. A bronze pendant from Troy 2 from the mid-3rd millennium BC displays a rayed cross with radiating lines confirmed as a solar symbol in ritual contexts. In the broader Indo-European context of Asia Minor, at Kultepe, 2400 BC, associated with pre-Hittite cultures and possibly linked to Indo-European migrations, a pottery shred shows a squared circle with concentric square and circle incisions confirmed as a solar motif in early Indo-European influenced assemblages. A stone relief from Beit Sultan, roughly 2300 BC, bears a rayed cross recognized as a solar symbol in a cultic context. The swastika and its spread are also interesting. For example, the symbol is confirmed on a Troy 2 spindle whorl, 2600 BC, incised with a four-armed hooked cross, recognized as a symbol of generation and solar rebirth. This aligns indeed with Indo-European migrations, as we've seen. Troy 2 shows cultural links to steppe-derived groups, that is, Yamnaya ancestry in Anatolia, among the other things. These swastikas spread to India is evidence in the Harappan culture, with a clear example on a seal from Mohenjo-Daro, we're roughly in 2000 BC, which is very interesting because basically we're talking the Andronovo culture that had, and here there was a bridge like from the Yamnaya to the Sintashta, we're in Central Western Asia, and then Andronovo is the place where chariot warfare probably spreads, and you immediately see the Mohenjo-Daro being taken over at that point. It's not just about the chariot, but it's all the moral system that had emerged through that. And this shows a four-armed swastika likely adopted, in fact, via the Indo-European and Indo-Aryan migrations through Central Asia. In China, the swastika appears later in the Yao culture. We are, again, between 2000 and 1500 BC on a painted pottery from Qinghai, and it's, again, what we got so far. But, of course, this stuff was already around. This is confirmed as a solar symbol, definitely possibly introduced to step in interactions. This really aligns, by the way, with all what we know with the timeline of Indo-European expansion. And so again, yes, China did display that as well. It's very rarely said, but it's also pretty obvious considering that China also had very strong relations with the steppes, not differently from Europe. In some cases, even more directly, even though we should explain in which sense. But among all these finds, the most prominent, as far as the spread of Indo-European solar symbolism, is the one from the central Anatolian tombs of Alakta Uyuk. We're talking specifically about 13 royal tombs from roughly 2400 BC, excavated by Arik, containing bronze hammer-headed pins identified as a steppe-derived style associated with Indo-European groups like the Yamnaya, suggesting northern influence. A bronze standard from Tomb L features a swastika confirmed as a solar symbol alongside other standards with radiant disk motifs. Also included some of this in the pictures, circular designs with radiating lines. Another standard from Tomb B depicts a large stag flanked by two smaller bulls, a bronze open-work plaque interpreted as a symbolizing solar or celestial power, contrasting with southern Anatolian earth-focused iconography. By the way, the stag is actually partly a chthonic symbol, but it's dual, like in most of this symbology, and it represents what Latins would have called the spolia opium. And so it's an idea of higher nobility that gets sacrificed in order to trigger essentially the divine transfiguration from the side of this layer that therefore kills its best, the most prelibate part of oneself or the world to, however, get that higher power could not be gotten elsewhere through this self-sacrifice. It's not a surprise that it's also a very famous Christian and probably Christ's symbolism, which has in fact the same identical meaning. We also looked at this symbol, we're talking about broader Indo-European migrations in that video about the Latium Vetus, about the Rome of the Kings, where we do have stag symbolism among Latin patricians, and this is actually quite powerfully Indo-European in that kind of sense, again, of the spolia opium, just given that we are in Latium. So this is very important because, by the way, we are with this finding at the beginning of the Hittite civilization. The later Hittite reliefs of roughly 1700 BC further carried that solar symbolism in sort of now more sort of gentrified, modernized, secularized ways. We can so say by those also greater influences that had come from the surrounding neighbors, or the Semites, etc. But there is no doubt that the swastika and the stag bull depicted in this art, the swastikas, these are standards, right, indicate a shift towards patriarchal, sky-oriented symbolism, distinct from earlier Telluric traditions in the region, and this go in parallel with definitely the Indo-European invasions and settlement. Speaking of this other symbolism, the bull, this is a symbol of raw generative power linked to fertility ideologies and crudely portrayed with the naked goddess in Europe's earliest farming cultures. The stag comes in contrast with this. This is the animal of northern hunters, known as the sole animal of the Nordic men, right? The animal almost of the Arctic civilization, and I will spare you the Hyperborean connections, because otherwise it will be immediately qualified as a neo-Nazi in here, but we will talk about that too, because it's so crucial to tradition, even though it really starts getting exoteric to an important degree and beyond sort of the normal paths of men. So, as we've seen, both the stag and the bull are actual. They're something different. You see, the stag is a prey for the northern hunter, whereas the bull, it's something instead more. So India had that Indo-European legacy, but has also this massive chthonic feminine element to it still, because it could not be fully extirpated. And it would have been integrated, if anything, as a subject element. But, you can't kill a cow. So this is, in part, deriving also from the mixing of previous Indo-European intuitions. But the notion is that in the feminine chthonic culture, the bull is there mostly as a manifestation of that telluric force. So there is something more heavenly leaning, right? If anything, the bull can also come back to the earth in a sacrifice, as it was carried out in some also pre-Indo-European cultures, and there are blendings. There is a spectrum in this. But the stag is a key to a higher dimension. The bull is also to a lower one. It's not like it's not powerful and strong, and it's, again, also a bit like the horse that becomes at that point also something much greater than these symbols for the Indo-Europeans for obvious reasons. But there is both a heavenly and a telluric element to this. The stag is closely tied to solar and light symbolism. The Edda, for example, says, "I saw the sun stag coming from the south." The south, right? Its feet stood on the earth, but its antlers reached the sky. You see the double symbolism. And by the way, there is here the south, yes, is that direction where the conqueror goes, but it's also something that rises up towards the north. And there is actually a balance between a meeting point in the European cosmological understanding, that is where the meeting point that is very spot on between what we would call, say, between tradition and what we would call today modernity, that flourish as much as the Indo-European civilization, when conquered the civilization of the mother, was not erased. It was basically subjugated and used exactly in this way to become the sacrificial victim for augmenting the power of the father. It's the woman that is transfigured into the heavenly maiden that brings the same divine. It has become one with one of the hero, the glorious hero that is in the Mars Triumphalis in self-sacrifice in holy combat, because truly this chthonic telluric cult of the mother was understood in that dark, underworldly, infernal fashion. Today we haven't digressed too much in these archetypal meanings, but I made multiple videos about tradition for you to know very well what we're talking about. So the stag's destiny is to come to the north and to be slain halfway somehow, but somebody who had gone towards the south and encountered this magnificent animal that is an in-between thing. There are many other beautiful Indo-European traces in different European cultures. For example, numerous prehistorical depictions, particularly those in the in Val Camonica in northern Italy, where the stag's antlers are stylized as a solar disk, are incredibly telling. You know very well that the Communion cross is de facto swastika, is a very powerful solar symbol as well. And by the way, it's still the symbol, the coat of arms of the contemporary region of Lombardy in the Italian Republic. And this population in the depths of the mountains between Lombardy and Veneto represented this solar symbolism, particularly in the moment in which Italy was invested by the Indo-European migrations ex post. If we're talking the early Iron Age, they had already come from before, as we've seen, but let's say there was probably a more pronounced invasion around something 1300, 1200 BC that was very incisive. And again, Indo-Europeans were in part already there, the symbols were part already there, but the communion rose, as it's actually called, is one of the most beautiful Indo-European solar symbolisms that you can find. As we were hinting at before, in the fringes of Europe, especially the northwest, something very interesting also was happening in the fringe. It's noteworthy, in fact, that in Ireland, when Celtic groups encountered the indigenous Iberian population that, as you know, stemmed from these pre-Indo-European populations at large that had literally crossed from the Iberian Peninsula to northern Europe, the stag and bull assume central roles in the Gaelic sagas. For example, in the Leinster one, the term os, dag, and ag refer to the stag, right? While in the Ulster saga, they come to mean bull. And there is a sort of syncresis here. Think about how powerful feminine elements are, like in the Morrigan, in Coco Lane. There is definitely a lot of that trace of darkness that those Celtic, in fact, the Celts are not that Apollonian as, I don't know, even the Germans were pretty dark in many ways, but you find more Apollonian symbolism among the Germans even. It is a bit typical of this northern symbolism, whereas, as we've seen, sort of the more blessed conquerors in southern Europe were, as we've seen, achieving even more with an Apollonian vision of themselves, such as especially the Dorians, but also, again, the Romans managed to reinvert like the gradual, because the risk here was always, and we discussed this in the video about the moral superiority of Roman civilization, that especially in the more populated Mediterranean, when these feminine influences were stronger, the latter could retake some kind of power. Instead, the Romans radically and for good invert this process and transfigured evangelically the entire world in their Catholic mission as a chosen people of the Godfather, the Deus, that is like Zeus before we said, the Demeter, it's exactly the same thing, had granted properly the privilege of world domination and the entire concept of Romanity, fulfilling to the fullest the Indo-European Evangelion in the history of mankind till to this day. So underlying this symbolic conflict that would have been, however, a very real one, because we know that, I don't know, when the Indo-Europeans overran, began to raid, to attack places like the ones of the civilization of the mother in Serbia, suddenly things began to change. They began to build fortresses, in part because some Indo-Europeans had begun to settle there as lords, in part because they had to protect themselves now. So really shattering the entire metaphysical paradigm of these peoples and enforcing a male authority over this female-dominated world that would invert, in a sense, great part of what had been the fall of men, like it's explained in mythological texts. The expansion of the battle axe peoples and the spread of Indo-European languages is an event of profound and spiritual importance that transcends possibly any other historical one in a metaphysical dimension, and in one that is, as you understand, layered with multiple steps. That is not just merely this expansion, it's also what this people was able to accomplish in later times at different stages and still to this day. The world's destiny is tied to that. We will explain why at some point, but it really represents the paternal principle clashing with the civilization of the mother, like the Olympian masculinity opposing the towering and maternal fertility myth. If anything, the woman is to be ingratiated and possessed and tamed and led and allowed to flourish under such virile guidance. The ethos of men's societies, challenging the ecstatic promiscuity of the ancient matriarchy and the collectivistic and the socialistic world that was entailed by that, and that in fact crumbled in the face of the virile onslaught, right? To a level of brutality, by the way, it is difficult probably to find in other times in history, because the clash was... it's not like it wasn't importantly fought. In fact, great part of Indo-European mythology stresses the fight against the monsters. In fact, these beings that were tellurically nourished, right, is the sort of the big dumb boy, like Mummy's boy, that is, yes, big and furious and doesn't know how to handle himself, the titans, the monsters, etc. And so that the Indo-European hero that actually represents himself as smaller than this gigantic enemy, slain with the principle of psychophysical superiority in a deeper, more absolute, and in fact Catholic essence, right? And this is again important because it shows you also how this wasn't simply a given, right? This inversion of the world's hand had to be fought for. It had to be wanted. This is what I would like to leave you with when thinking about also the causes of the Indo-European migration. These are topics that nobody really teaches in school, and as I said at the beginning of the video, there are many big, but also pretty clear, and in this sense, when understood, not really forgivable, let's say, and forgettable for that matter, motivations that in fact are a bit inherent to our entire archetypal understanding of reality. And so if we don't understand this primarily genetic sort of foundational moment, we will never understand any element of the one that in society has been hierarchically ordered by the European government. The repercussions of this conflict still resonate across the world. You can argue that after, even like they were aware, like when you look at history, when you look at the Dorian and the Latin migrations, for example, these were very aware. The Romans were very aware of their choices regarding the future of the world. Like, so they laid the groundwork for the classical worldview in ways that we tend to mistake for, again, some modern secular version of the story. That in part is even true, but that was primarily pushed by the awareness of their origins. Very different situation, because again, mostly the Romans did this ex post migration. But regardless of the fact that, of course, the site of Rome was already populated from much before, and probably, in fact, by Indo-Europeans way before that. Of course, the city was ever conceived in a broader and everlasting sense, right? It was a foundational moment. We were told properly by the Roman sagas that are, as you know, incredibly Indo-European, with Romulus Caelus, and we've seen Livy's understanding still in the 1st century BC of what kind of Catholic meaning laid under the foundation of Rome in quite potent ways. We heard those echoes just in Virgil. We were discussing this the other day in the video about the Italic migrations of the Sea People's times, because we see a lot of back and forth also across the Mediterranean in terms of Indo-European movements. This is quite fascinating because we observed how It's not like at times these were at some point big groups moving. Unfortunately, we can't track very well, but there was also continuous movement and continuous waves, and probably we would be surprised at how similar these patterns look compared to the later Indo-European movements. Say, I don't know, the migration era, various other spreads from within the same Europe. Think about the Celtic migration in particular. This is, again, really fascinating because, as you understand, it's not so straightforward, right? We don't see, for example, the Germans migrating in the same way that what we understand the corded Ware would have done. There is a shift in the change that at some point during the migration era, the Iranian world is taken over, so the whole IMAT of the Indo-Europeans was taken over by other Indo-Europeans. And as we've seen, that the same dynamic likely happened between the corded Ware and the Yamnaya back in the 3rd millennium BC. So it's a very nuanced issue. You'll see how the impact of this rapid rise of this incredibly European, in fact, looking people is felt in distant centers of influence at times, from the Persian plateaus to the edges of India. There is a very staunchly marked sense of this big warriors, mostly associated, as we've seen, the solar symbol with a horse, with this ferocious but dangerous barbarity, of course, also from the perspective of cultures that had come to develop, maybe even through their input, but that had consolidated some sort of previous ethnical identity on their own, right? So we'll talk about this naturally in other videos, etc. We've seen how China. There is always the Western legend that at some point emerges, and that doesn't necessarily have to do with this dynamics at all. In fact, it predates them in a sense, but the notion that, I don't know, even the Egyptians have this explicit information that the race of kings, the race of gods, had come from the West, right? It's something that is connected to the megaliths that we were talking about before. Is connected to some sort of reaction to the civilization of the mother that restarts from the humus, from the fall of something that likely was a previous civilization provided with what these peoples remembered as really superior characteristics. And this is, again, not a conspiracy. This is what the conspiracists have heard, but have never studied from the actual sources that they, again, substitute with, again, technology, with archaeology, or whatever is supposed to be that's deterministic and materialistic nonsense that is, in fact, the civilization of the mother. It's not like it's nonsense, but it's nonsense in the sense that alone, without this documentary integration, you cannot use it to prove anything, right? Especially with their ill-informed narratives. People should understand that, again, sources are way more valid. You have no idea how many people are coming back to the civilization of the mother just by radically rejecting any kind of standard. The civilization of the mother must be integrated and protected and dominated and tamed and owned, right, in order to be fully functional. And the Indo-European migration, as you know, includes the female deities within the system, including probably the ones of specifically chthonic origin, because there are also the deities of the heavenly maiden. If you look at Athena, if you look at other forces that are Apollonian in nature. In fact, Athena is always paired with her brother. So there is a very powerful symbolism that must be entangled. We'll pass through the soul of chivalry. We will talk again about how this informed, for example, the imperial ideology in the Middle Ages and beyond. But it's important also to start from the start. And therefore, I think this video tells something about it. I love the fact that I'm putting so much out there, and even though it's relatively disappointing that a few people watch my content. I enjoy the fact that this happens because most people don't have the will to listen when they actually are. Because I have actually a pretty high, as you know, attention, reach, and rate in the clicks, but it's as if people either watched it all, like, or not. Like, it's you either hate or love me. I also see here that there is also a consistent amount of this is an Indo-European, Indo-European history playlist that made actually lots of videos. This is a very recent playlist, and it made so much already, and thousands of views. So this, I guess, is what most people are after. Could be a strategy to include more videos of that. No, as you know, I don't do clickbaiting. I will add this also in the new Imperial Catholic Traditional History, which has made a congruous amount of views, not as much. It's mostly started in the earlier days, and then we will see, because, again, there is always a chance for new ideas, but they also have to work in a way or another. And just note this, if you arrive till the end, the entire channel is informed by the things that I'm talking about. So you can't basically watch anything without realizing, if you want to understand it, that it is all tied to the rest. And so it doesn't make any sense just to watch one thing and pretending that you have heard a standalone thing. It doesn't work like that here. Here you have ideally to listen to the whole thing in order to understand the whole thing, right? This video, I think, will maybe not make too many views, more than the average, but I expect, of course, it to be watched. And this is, again, just the beginning of a series. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.